Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for what is sure to be an interesting talk. I know because I've seen Miles Harvey speak before about this book and was very impressed. I knew a little bit about the LeMoyne etchings, but didn't really realize kind of how precarious the line of communication was that these things even exist, and also that it gives us a glimpse into a Florida that there is simply no visual record for. All these Indians would be wiped out by smallpox and warfare in the following years. So the images that we have are really truly treasures, and we have a full copy of the LeMoyne etchings, and they're all available now online thanks to our digitization unit. So all that can be accessed online. All of the plates, the visual plates, and they're really fascinating, I think, to look at whether you're into Florida history or not. And this event is part of our Florida initiative, Floridiana, documenting the history of Florida, and also it's part of our ongoing tradition of celebrating Native American Heritage Month. We are the only unit on campus usually that throws an event for Native American Heritage Month, and we've been proudly doing it for a decade now. Everything from artists, activists, archaeologists, and so on. So I do thank you all for being here and taking part in the event. We've got a special treat today with Miles Harvey. He is author of Painter in a Savage Land, The Strange Saga of the First European Artist in North America. It's published by Random House in 2008. He received a 2008 Editor's Choice Award from Booklist and a Best Books citation from the Chicago Tribune. His previous book, The Island of Lost Maps, A True Story of Cartographic Crime, also published by Random House, is a national, international bestseller, was selected by USA Today as one of the top 10 best books of 2000, and is the recipient of the 2007-2008 Knight Wallace Fellowship at the University of Michigan and a 2004-05 Illinois Arts Council Award for Fiction. Harvey has taught at Northwestern University, the University of Chicago, and the University of New Orleans. So without further ado, I'll step aside and give him the spotlight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. I should add to that wonderful introduction that I currently teach at DePaul University, and I only say that because I'm up for tenure this year, and if this film gets out and I don't say it, I'm probably in big trouble. So I want to thank Andy for having me here, and Dean Garrison, and just I want to thank the USF Library in general. This is actually nice for me to be back here in any number of ways. I love talking about this book, but USF was, a lot of the images from this book are from the excellent LeMoyne collection, and USF was very helpful in making those images available to me, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful for that. So I'm really glad to be here celebrating Native American Heritage Month. And I want to just start thinking about the exchange between Europeans and Native Americans. And I think a lot of what we've seen from the 16th century on, from the 15th century on, is a failure to see. And I think we still have that failure to see, but this book is about an attempt to see. And it's about a very difficult, and one realizes when one looks into the story you're about to hear, is how difficult that attempt is and was. So I just want to have you imagine yourself. It's June 25th, 1564. Now, historians have placed that as the St. John's River in Jacksonville, at the mouth of that river. But in fact, we don't have any physical evidence of that. But it is a river right around there. And I think the metaphor here is to imagine I think we're sort of familiar with this exchange, but I think if we defamiliarize ourselves a little bit, I think it's helpful because it's what the two peoples who are coming together. Think of space aliens, right? If you're landing on a planet and all you know about that planet is that there's intelligent life on that planet. So on the Native American side, they saw the French ships and were astounded, according to the French. Many of the people had probably seen at least one French ship before, or one ship before. But I suppose if a flying saucer landed in the parking lot in front of the library, we'd still be astounded the second time it happened, as well as the first time it happened. So on the French side, you're seeing fires on the shore. As you get close, you're seeing some people with incredibly odd hairstyles, much different than European hairstyles. Bodies tattooed from head to foot. Sharpened fingernails so that they look like switchblades on your fingers. Some men clearly dressed and acting in some way as women. The women wearing Spanish moss, like the Spanish moss you're so familiar with here. In the parking lot, I was looking at it and said, oh, looks like one of the drawings, as skirts, right? So it's a really, really different thing. Now imagine yourself as like this, you're one of the first people ever to see it. So Native Americans had been known to the Europeans, but until this time, and again, I just want to stretch this space alien thing a little bit farther, they'd been represented by people who'd never been to America, right? And who were going off stories and myths, just like we might draw E.T. or something. So here's an image before Jaques LeMoyne de Morgues, the subject of this book, came. Can anyone spot what's wrong with this picture? Where do we start? Well, you'll notice that there's like a European-style butcher shop here. These are the Carib Indians. I think, well, I'm not sure which island, but we got the European-style butcher shop. Instead of sausages hanging up there, we have arms and legs. Some nice chopping going on. You'll see over here some snacking, like you might do at McDonald's on a human arm, right? So what else is wrong with this picture? Anyone want to jump in? Yeah, the people aren't people. Okay, here. Yeah, what you?
I was going to say that people don't have human heads.
Yes. People don't have human heads. Why don't they have human heads? They have heads of dogs. Why is that? Yes? Could be the source, but more immediately, Christopher Columbus came back. He had heard stories, or had made up stories based on, as you say, previous myths that were floating around Europe about a race of human beings that had the snouts of dogs, as Columbus put it, and ate other human beings, right? So this is not like, this is what was represented as Native Americans before LeMoyne came along. Can anyone else see a problem with this picture? Unless they're extinct now, and no one knew about it, llamas in the Caribbean. That guy is riding a llama, right? So that's what's wrong with that picture. So the artist I wrote about in this book, Jaques LeMoyne de Morgues, is the first known artist sent to North America for the express purpose of recording the people, places, flora, and fauna. So, some background on LeMoyne. He was born in 1533, which is a strangely important year in European history. So it's the 1500th year of Christ's death, and as a result, it was a very apocalyptic time. He was born into a world where people thought they were at end times. In fact, one German preacher came up with a mathematical formula that predicted the world would end at precisely 8 a.m., October 9th, 1533. He had a huge following, as cults now might. They gathered, waited for the end of the world. I guess they wouldn't have checked their watches, but checked the sky, said this isn't happening, went home, made up nasty songs about this man. LeMoyne lived until 1588. And just to give you like a bookmark, that also was a year of apocalyptic fevers, right? Why? Why did he live in this time of turbulence? Well, it was just a completely anxiety-ridden time for one reason. There was this incredible religious upheaval, right? So the Protestant Revolution had begun less than 20 years earlier in 1517, but was already spreading through Europe. And also in 1533, the year of LeMoyne's birth, a Frenchman named Jean Calvin had a religious epiphany and converted to Protestantism, and that quickly, Calvin's version of Protestantism quickly spread through France. And it was like a wildfire. And during LeMoyne's life, there was this incredible anxiety, rivalries, killings between Catholics and Protestants. And the first war of religion had happened 2 years before LeMoyne came to the U.S. It was also a time of an intense French and Spanish rivalry. And again, there was a huge, this was the time of the Inquisition. We'll talk about it in a minute, but huge anxiety about that too, religious-based. All right, so in addition to these religious upheavals, there were revolutions going on in science, in exploration, obviously, in cartography and art. And Jaques LeMoyne de Morgues was like a zealot in these. He was like cut in on all these revolutions, right? So I just want to show you quickly a painting he did of, so that's what we would call starflower. So let's just flip back and forth a minute. There's one representation. Now this is a European plant. This isn't a New World plant. But you can see that it's a really different way of conceptualizing the world. It's an attempt to see the world as it is. So before this, in medieval times, plants were types, like humans were types. So we saw the dog-faced man. This is an attempt to show the world as it actually is. And it's a really different way of seeing. So some background on the French mission. So it wasn't the first French mission to Florida. At this time, as many of you know, La Florida, as it was called, was unsettled, right? There'd been some attempts. Spain, which was the dominant power in the Americas at that time, claimed it. Well, the Portuguese were there too, but Spain claimed this whole region. And when we're talking about Florida, we're not talking about modern-day borders. We're talking about the American Southeast, right? Claimed it as their own, but they'd never been able to build and sustain a settlement on it. So it's sort of like me saying, I claim Tampa as mine, as Miles Harvey land, right? Unless I can build a city there, it's not really mine, right? And the French knew that. So they had tried to establish a colony there in 1562, and they left behind several monuments, at least a couple of them. And we can see one of those monuments there. And these were, acts of possession, right? These were these big stone monuments they brought with them from France. And they put one up there and one up in what's now Paris Island in the Carolinas, South Carolina. And eventually they returned. That French colony in 1562, like most colonies in the New World at that time, didn't do so well. It got wiped out. The French left a small group there, and they didn't get along with the Indians, and they couldn't feed themselves, and all the typical stuff. Some of them got in a boat they made themselves, which is just stunning, and managed to make it back to Europe. But essentially, it was a failure. So LeMoyne and his crew come along a second time. And so this is the first contact between LeMoyne's group and the Native Americans. Again, Historians have often placed this at St. John's Bluff in Jacksonville, but again, we don't have any physical evidence of that. And in fact, the more they look for evidence, the less they find there, right? So what was LeMoyne doing there? This was his commanding officer and the local Indian chieftain. The Spanish before them had been to the New World plenty, but the Spanish did incredibly little recording of Native Americans. And this is basically because the Spanish didn't seem to see Native Americans as full human beings or really worthy of study in a way, right? They were into possession. The French were no less covetous of this land, right? But they had a different approach. They sort of saw it as a good business practice to study the Native Americans, right? This wasn't a beautiful gesture, oh, we recognize you as full human beings. But they wanted to form alliances with the natives. And they wanted to understand the natives so that they could get to the gold, all the things the Spanish did, right? But, it really was a difference. Nonetheless, it's the first step towards acknowledging the other as a human being, right? Maybe a small step, maybe a not lasting step, but I really do think it's the first step. Artists sent to Mexico before this had painted conquistadors and religious scenes for the Spanish. Here you've got a French artist sent over to say, hey, what are these people like, right? So how do you see these people? Well, it's really difficult. So one French artist and explorer before LeMoyne, who was in South America, said this: because of their gestures and countenances, they are so different from ours. I confess it is difficult to represent them properly in words or even painting. And LeMoyne is trying to do that. He's trying to get to it. So here's one of the images he did. And we should say straight up that there are no paintings left of his work. So there are these engravings, like you have here at the USF Library, based on the paintings. Or maybe there are paintings left. We'll see. We'll get to that. So, this is a picture based apparently on one of his lost paintings. And does anyone strike? I mean, what does that look like to you? Huh? A wedding. Yeah. Looks like Europeans. Yeah. So one critic called the king Apollo-like and compared the women to Botticelli nudes. LeMoyne, and we can talk more about this later. I want to talk more about this later. I think he really did attempt to see the natives. There's stuff here that I think is original to these paintings. He does attempt to capture their customs, and we'll talk about that. But whereas earlier artists had given us one side of a divide that has blinded us to Native Americans, the cannibal, right? The semi-human or non-human cannibal. LeMoyne gives us something that's the other side, which is a noble savage, right? The great innocent people living in this paradise, right? And it really goes back to Greek and Roman myths, this sort of idea of this perfect place before original sin in a way, right? So, but he did a lot of these pictures, or we have a lot of his prints left. This is some Native Americans crossing a stream, just a very, kind of beautiful domestic scene in a way, right? This is his family. Actually, they're going on a picnic, the caption says, basically, right? So they're taking their fruits across the water to go eat, hang out. He recorded really interesting native customs. So these people are drinking something called the black drink, which was a ceremonial drink made of a certain holly plant familiar to North Florida, southern Georgia. And you can see that it was, something you use to purge yourself, right? So, and the Europeans, LeMoyne, were really impressed with this drink. He talked about how you can endure hunger and thirst for 24 hours at a time if you just have this drink. Well, it may be that it really did have those powers over the Europeans. So think about what's going on in Europe with drink at that time. No coffee, no tea, no chocolate yet, really, in wide, right? In other words, no caffeine. This stuff is loaded with caffeine, right? This is like the Starbucks, right? And the Europeans are going there and saying, whoa, this is pretty good, even though I have to throw up after I drink it, right? So and this is an important ceremonial drink. It's been written about by a lot of other people, but here's an image from it. Here's another really interesting image. These men they're not really men or women. They're called two spirits, right? And this is another thing southeastern natives, Native Americans in other regions too, but this is almost like a third sex, and it's very, very interesting. So, and there's a lot of controversy about whether these people chose this identity. I mean, we come from a time where we talk about gender, like how we self-identify, right? Some historians say, no. These guys were picked at a young age to do this. This was not their choice. I don't think we know. In any case, they have ceremonial functions that are really important, caring for the sick being one of them. And they serve really as a go-between gender. They have some roles of men, some roles of women. They have important battlefield roles. They have very important roles when it comes to food. So so these are initial images of them. Here's another. Does anyone see anything interesting going on here? There's a lot going on. Here's something that's really interesting. There's tobacco, right? So, and interestingly enough, as a little side note, while LeMoyne and the French were in this colony, 1564, 1565 in Florida, one of their visitors was the famous British corsair / pirate, John Hawkins. And Hawkins was on a slave run. He was making his money then by getting African slaves. He was really early on this and selling them to the Spanish. And he came up here to Florida for reasons that aren't quite known. And he and his men observed LeMoyne and his comrades. And one of the things one of the people from Hawkins' crew wrote about is that the French had picked up this habit of tobacco, right? We know why. It's like caffeine. We love it, right? It's addictive. And Hawkins is often given credit to bringing tobacco back to England. His visit was only 3 days in Florida, and I'm just going to do a quick aside here. But Hawkins really, first of all, you see the English coming to this part of the world. So Hawkins is a slave trader. What happens with tobacco? Well, sometime later, Virginians figure out that they can grow tobacco. There's a huge market for it by that time in England. P.S., how do they make it grow? They get slaves. So in some ways, this trip to Florida for 3 days with LeMoyne was just really a monumental one for Hawkins and his men. LeMoyne also recorded Native American rituals of all kinds. Here's one that's according to LeMoyne, and that's all we have left, is a tribute to the sun. The natives, he writes, would take this stag and they'd stuff it with really good food, really good plants. And this was a ceremony to ask the sun to give them good food back for the next year. And so food becomes very, very important to LeMoyne's story, as we'll learn later. Okay, we'll go down here. So why were the French there? And I don't have an easy answer to it. Religious freedom, yes, check, right? They were at a time when Protestants were persecuted in France. And in fact, it was coming off the first of many, many wars of religion in France. These totally awful fratricidal wars that would go on for many decades, right? Another theory, they were there to set up a pirate base where they could hit the Spanish fleet as it went up Florida. Because of the trade winds, you go up the coast of Florida. Was that true? Yeah, probably true too. First permanent colony for a future French empire in Florida, was that their motivation? Yeah, probably was. Or what are these guys doing? Mining for gold to seek instant riches. Yeah, probably that too. I'm not a historian by trade, and the historians argue about this a lot, but it makes sense to me that they were there to do a little bit of each, partly because they acted on a little bit of each of those things, right? So this was after the discovery of incredible loads of precious metals in both Mexico and Peru, and it was a time when people were out looking for the next haul, right? I mean, again, you have to put yourself in these guys' shoes and say, wow, they had reason to expect that they could find gold. So this is an image of the Native Americans seeking gold. Here's a map that says gold, silver, and copper are found here. So this hunt for gold led the French to a series of alliances with Indians. They kept trying to get to it. Whether it was a mythical hoard of gold or not is hard to determine. It also led to a bloody mutiny, which LeMoyne was temporarily taken prisoner in that mutiny and barely survived it. And it also led to a horrible famine because at some point the local Indians stopped feeding the French, especially when their own food ran out. And the French were literally starving to death. So that famine in turn led to a bloody confrontation with the natives when the French basically went to try to force the Native Americans to give them food. And there was a bloody skirmish. The local Indians surprised the French as they came out with some bags of food, and LeMoyne was injured in that skirmish. We don't quite know how, but a witness to the event said that the Indians were shooting at the French's face and legs because those were the places where there weren't armor. So I think it's fair to conclude he was wounded with an arrow wound. He was out of action for a matter of weeks, either in the face or the legs. And as a PS, getting an arrow wound then was a brutal thing. Like surgery in the 16th century was miserable, and it's something you wouldn't want. So just surviving that is pretty good. All right, so this French colony is now feuding. Their whole idea of, well, we'll observe these people, study them, make friends with them, has gone down the tubes, right? And now they are waiting and hoping for nothing more than the French to rescue them. Meanwhile, the Spanish have found out about them. And there's this guy, Pedro Menendez, not a kind human being, very smart human being, but he was looking for the French colony. Eventually, through many, just jumping over a lot of history, he found it. LeMoyne and many massacres were committed, and the French died. LeMoyne was one of a few people who managed to escape the Spanish, get back on a boat with almost no food or clothing, and make it back to Europe, eventually first to France, where he survived the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, where thousands of Protestants were slaughtered. This guy was a survivor. And then he moved to England and worked for this guy. Anyone recognize him? Sir Walter Raleigh, famous writer, adventurer, Queen Elizabeth was much impressed with him for times in her career, right? But Raleigh was really interested in a British colony in North America. And essentially, he put together what we'd now call a think tank. He gathered the best people from around the country and around the world to try to figure out how the English could establish a colony in North America, and LeMoyne was one of those people. So again, there's this sort of 16th century zealot quality to him. And one of the people he worked with there was the now famous artist John White, who was one of the people who survived the Roanoke colony. And White's a really interesting guy. It appears that LeMoyne either gave him some instruction or at least some moral support. There's no evidence of them having conversations, but they were both working for Raleigh at the same time. White's paintings we have, and his engravings we have, so we can compare them. They're really close, and as you can see from this, White didn't completely get rid of this sort of making the natives look like Europeans, but he did a much better job of it. And so there's a step forward. White was also just wonderful watercolor painter, as was LeMoyne of Flora and Fauna. Here's a flying fish he did. And so LeMoyne contributed that way. Now, so we've got all these White paintings. None of LeMoyne's paintings survived, or at least that's what people thought, until this showed up in 1901, right? We've seen that image before. It's the initial contact between the French and the European, or the Native Americans, and you can see the sexy natives bowing down to the French. LeMoyne never did another painting like that we know of, that was sort of this imperial fantasy, right? What's wrong with this picture? Yeah, the colors are weird, right? They're just weird. This is at the New York Public Library. And when I went there to visit there, that guy said at one point this would have been like, if we had a fire at the New York Public Library, this would be one of the things we'd grab. I'm sure you've got them at USF, right? The few things you say, you know, your puppy dogs, right? They're the ones you take. Not so much anymore. So there's a lot of things wrong with this picture, but the color is one of them. There's stuff wrong with the picture that was wrong with the engraving, right? Those are European baskets. Certainly not what the Indians would have had. The fruits and vegetables are not likely to have been from that region, right? But the big thing is, it looks, and the overwhelming consensus is now that this was a painting based on the engraving and not vice versa, right? So this is one of the many mysteries surrounding LeMoyne's work. There are many others, and they make it fun and interesting and baffling and frustrating. Here's one. Here's an alligator, so-called. What's wrong with this alligator? Anyone? Yeah, got ears. Yeah, it's just, and it's like 15 times the size of a human being, right? Hard to tell where that came from. We don't know if LeMoyne drew it from memory. LeMoyne, when he escaped the French, or when he escaped the Spanish, he had to wade through that. He just ran out of the building, right? Then he had to wade through swamps. It's unlikely he got his drawings out. On the other hand, there were visitors who he might have sent drawings out with, but there's another one. But it's really hard to justify the guy who can paint these plants with such precision and beauty, right? With this, right? I mean, it's just, again, it's a stunning, stunning difference. So there's this guy. This guy met LeMoyne late in life. His name is Theodore de Bry. He was a great popularizer. He is the guy who turned LeMoyne's paintings into engravings. And he further messes us up because we don't know what's Debris' mistake, because Debris was like he's like the Hollywood version of LeMoyne, right? So based on the true story, like Hollywood doesn't really care about the details, right? This is him. He didn't really care about the details. Here's an example. This is a picture of killing of centuries. What's the problem with this picture? Well, that kind of club is Brazilian. There's no evidence ever of it being in Florida. Is it possible there was some kind of exchange? Sure. Is it possible LeMoyne, trying to draw from memory years later, paint from memory, couldn't remember what the clubs really looked like, the way we might not remember what, color shirt we wore yesterday, let alone 2 years earlier? Sure. And, there were plenty of images of clubs by that point from other artists he could have borrowed from. It's also really possible this guy Debris just stuck that in there. So we just don't know. The mysteries just keep growing and growing and growing. And one of the biggest problems is, as we were talking about earlier, LeMoyne did not have a visual language to draw the Native Americans and to paint them. So this was the kind of art that was popular in France at the time. It's called mannerism. Hugely stylized kind of painting, very beautiful in some ways. Classical scenes, right? Based on Greek and Roman scenes. Very stylized bodies, these long-necked women, right? And you can see there's a LeMoyne engraving to one side, and there's a pretty well-known Mannerist painting on the other. And you can see even in the sort of, right, the sort of movements, the sort of contortions of the body. So this was the language he had to work with, and I think, one of the things that will always be mysterious about LeMoyne is that he didn't seem to be able to transcend that for whatever reason. He couldn't, even though this was an attempt to see, he couldn't see. He could only see through a visual language that he already had. So, but his work has revealed some mysteries. Here's the fort the French had, and here's another image of the fort. Does anyone see anything different about it? So, yeah, they don't look like they're from the same landmass. Now, this is a controversial thing, but it led to something. So there was an archaeologist a few years ago who said, hey, wait a minute. He went back to LeMoyne and said, wait a minute, those two aren't the same thing. He was looking for that earlier fort I told you about, Charles Fort. And he said, wow, this picture looks like Paris Island. This picture and it does. It looks like Paris Island. I wish I should have put a picture of Paris Island in here. And he said, it's not in scale, but I bet that's where that fort was. Well, P.S. he found the fort on Paris Island. Some people think he just got lucky, right? And then the question becomes, how did LeMoyne know where this fort was? Did he go on that first mission? It just keeps creating mysteries. So I had a mystery with my book, and one that I may have solved, or at least I hope I kicked the can down the road a little bit. Here are some of LeMoyne's beautiful natural history paintings of plants and small animals. As far as we know, this is what he did before he went to Florida and after he went to Florida. He's a master of this, right? So when he walked onto that boat in 64, he walks into history, and we don't know what he did before, and we really don't know what he did afterwards. And so I became really interested in these paintings. I mean, you can see the beauty of these paintings and, the whimsicality of them. So I got interested in LeMoyne, and it's always been said that he came from Dieppe in Normandy, but without boring you with details, I had reason to believe that's not true. That it's just something repeated and repeated. His name is Jaques LeMoyne de Morgues, and historians have always said there was no Morgue in France at that time. But thanks to the internet as a starting point, I found out there was this little hamlet called Morgue in France. And more important, it's near a bigger city and an artistic hub called Châteaudun. And in that city, there's another guy by the name of LeMoyne, Henri LeMoyne. And Henri LeMoyne was an embroiderer for Mary Queen of Scots, right? That was a big deal. There have been several books out about Mary Queen of Scots' obsession with embroidery. Henri LeMoyne was not in any of those books, so he, if nothing else, I found this cool guy who, and he was not only her embroiderer, he was her valet de chambre, which means he was in her inner circle. It's a really important thing. Well, why does this matter? It matters because it explains these paintings, right? Why LeMoyne wasn't painting these for scientific reasons. These books of his paintings, which still exist, are very whimsical. They're just about beautiful plants and little animals, right? Why would you need those? Well, for embroidery, right? So all that we know about embroiderers, that they used watercolors, exactly the kind of stuff he did. He was doing it really early. We know that there are traditions of families using this. We know that embroidery workshops would have needed a staff painter, right? We know that LeMoyne was really interested in embroidery himself. One of his books when he came to England was, my French is terrible, Le Clef de Champ, I think is how you say it. It was a little book for craftsmen, such as embroiderers, to use, and embroiderers did use it. And at the time, LeMoyne was under the employ of Lady Mary Sidney, Philip Sidney's mother, that family is very much closely tied to embroidery. Here's an image from that book, right? Here's a 16th century, they called it slip, a little piece of embroidery, right? So I think that's what he was doing. I think that he came from an embroidery workshop tradition and sort of took up painting Native Americans and mapping the Americas as an afterthought. So I said before that there were no paintings left of his. This painting was just recently discovered. I want to tell you about it. It's interesting. It's going to go on auction in a couple of weeks, December 3rd in Toulouse. It's watercolor on poplar, I guess. And it was the story behind it, and you really, those of you who work with auction houses can know you can never trust auction houses, was because there's no transparency. This is a whole different story. It's criminal. So this was supposedly discovered at a castle in central France, near Versailles, 40 years ago, and someone kept it in their closet for the last 40 years and suddenly came forward with it. Well, I'm not sure how much it'll go for. There's some hype about it. Most of the experts think that it's like that other painting, right? That it is not an original, it's a painting based on an engraving rather than vice versa. And I think they're probably right. Will we find LeMoyne's paintings? I don't know. I do know that his mysteries will endure, and I do know that he'll continue to speak to us as we move forward into the 21st century. And I thank you so much for hearing me out, and I'm glad to take questions now.